Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to another Chatting with NDGS Paleo. My name is Becky Barnes, and I am with the North Dakota Geological Survey. Today, we'll be talking about flight, invertebrates specifically, but we're going to be working with birds, bats, and pterosaurs, all kinds of things with backbones that fly, and how they accomplished it in different ways. Each path, or each group of creatures, took a different path to solve the mystery of flight, but they're not necessarily the first creatures to fly. The first creatures to fly are bugs. So bugs were the first creatures to really conquer the air. Mothra attack? No. All right, but we're not going to be talking about bugs today. Bugs are not my forte. I think they're amazing creatures, but I don't know a lot about bugs. So we're going to switch over to creatures that I know a little bit more about, things with backbones, including birds, bats, and pterosaurs. All right, birds, or pterosaurs, birds, and bats, going from the oldest to the youngest. Although birds, bats, and pterosaurs rolls off the tongue easier, but yeah, whatever. Anyways, true flight invertebrates, things that are actually flying through the air, not necessarily gliding through the air, although flying creatures can glide. So this is something that we might consider an arms race. Pterosaurs, and we're going to discuss what in the world a pterosaur is, birds and bats all use their arms to fly. All of these different creatures, and they do it differently. So in humans, here's our little human up here. We have our upper arm bone called the humerus. Here it is in our pterosaur, in our bird, and in our bat. Our lower limb bones, these are the radius and the ulna. You can see radius and ulna here. It's in this tan color. Here it is in the pterosaur, here it is in the bird, and here it is in the bat. And most of those are pretty similar between all four of these groups. And then things just start getting weird. We don't use our arms for flying. And so what we have our carpals. So that's your wrist bones right through here. You can bend and move and wiggle those around. Those are your carpals. You have your metacarpals, which is the flat part of your hand, the palm of your hand. These are long bones, metacarpals. And then you have your phalanges, which are little fingers. And if you happen to have claws, then the last little digit with a claw on it is called an ungual. We don't necessarily have those. We don't have claws. We have nails. So in our human, again, here's our carpals, here's our metacarpals, and here's our phalanges. In the pterosaur, they have lengthened out their metacarpals, so the palm of their hand, they've actually lengthened it out. And their flight membrane is suspended by an elongate pinky finger, essentially. It's like if we grew our pinky finger super long. I don't know specifically which digit it is, if it's actually 4 or 5, I don't remember off the top of my head, but we have this very, very long finger, phalange, that is suspending this membrane for flight. In the birds, they're starting to fuse up some of their metacarpals. If you've ever eaten a chicken or a turkey and you've chewed down on the wing for your dinner or lunch or whatever, take a look at those hand bones. They're really cool because they're all fused together, but they've also lengthened out a little bit more. The bats, however, decided to be a little bit weird, and they spread apart and lengthened out all of their palm metacarpals into very, very long extended fingers. So that's helping with their flight. So their membrane is caught between their fingers. Birds do things a little differently. They don't have a membrane specifically for flying. They do something different. We'll get to that. So pterosaurs, what in the world is a pterosaur? They're not dinosaurs. If you forget everything I talk about today, remember that pterosaurs are not dinosaurs. They lived at the same time as dinosaurs, but they're not dinosaurs. They are flying reptiles. And the first pterosaurs were discovered a long time ago, way down in 1784, by Cosimo Collini. And when he first looked at these and he saw these weird, long limbs, he thought, oh, these are certainly flippers. And so he actually thought that these creatures swam instead of flew. Then George Cuvier suggested that the animals could actually fly, not necessarily swim. He was a really, really good naturalist and anatomist, and he was fantastic at looking at parts and pieces between different animals and comparing and contrasting them to see how they were similar, how they were different, how did these bones from creatures that were no longer alive today compare with other creatures that were alive today, and make educated guesses on what these creatures were doing. So the word pterodactyl, which was coined after a number of different discoveries, was specifically named after one of these creatures called Pterodactylus, which sadly ends up plaguing paleontology for a long time. So this early pterosaur called Pterodactylus, it's a very specific animal. This creature right here at the bottom of your screen is Pterodactylus. This creature kind of enters the common tongue. It's kind of like the pet peeve that Jeff has as far as megalodon being now a common name for a shark. So this thing plagues paleontology, and so everybody starts calling all of these winged creatures pterodactyls, and that's not quite true. It doesn't work. It'd be like calling all of dogs like German Shepherdess. I don't know. It just doesn't work. Anyway, so the name stuck. So the question is, how did they end up evolving flight? Now, there are two main branches for creatures that fly. Did they have what's called a cursorial ancestry? And this is creatures that are running on the ground, they're jumping into the air higher and higher and higher. So they're running and they're using their arms to help lift themselves off the ground. Or did they have an arboreal ancestry? Arbor refers to tree. So creatures that were climbing up trees and making longer and longer jumps and glides between trees. So things that were gliding first instead of running first. So how in the world did pterosaurs get their flight? And the latest thinking right now is that they had a cursorial ancestry. But that's, again, kind of up in the air, as it were. These creatures are covered in a downy hair or an insulation. There are lots and lots of fossils of these creatures that have been found just covered in this downy coat. Their teeth suggest that they were piscivorous or fish-eating, as well as gut contents. Occasionally, these pterosaurs have been found with some gut content, so fish scales or bones within the belly cavity. And a lot of these creatures are found in marine deposits. Now, this could be an artifact of preservation in that things that fall into mud, this marine sediment, have a tendency to fossilize easier than things that are just left to rot on the ground. So if you're a pterosaur and you're flying around and you fall and die and you sink down to the bottom of the ocean or a sea or a pond or a lake or whatever, and you get covered by more and more mud, you fossilize actually pretty well. If you were to fall onto the forest floor where you have other scavengers that are coming around and they're gonna find your little carcass, you're probably not going to fossilize as well. You don't get covered with that fine layer of dirt or sediment and sand as quickly as you would if you were in the water. Now, pterosaurs are really cool. There's a huge variety in these beasties. Some are as small as a sparrow, very, very, very tiny, and some are as big as an airplane. There is a huge variety in there. And there are two main groups, just to throw in some more confusion, one of which, the earliest group, are called the rhamphorhynchoids, and the later group are the pterodactyloids, which of course, again, more confusion. So here is a really cool creature. I know I'm just kind of mixing these up a little bit, but this is just showing you one of the really, really tiny ones. So a Microraptor is a very, very small creature with only a 10-inch wingspan. So it's like that big, that's it. It's really, really tiny. Maybe it ate bugs, maybe it ate small creatures, but just showing you just one of these really tiny creatures. Here's his little beak in there, here's his wing, or his leg, excuse me, coming up over his wings, bent off to a very odd angle up in there. Versus one of our extremely large beasties. This is called Quetzalcoatlus, and this could have potentially have been found in North Dakota. but we haven't found it yet. We know they've been found down in Texas, but they were probably very long distance flyers. You never know that we could have found something like this up here, but extremely tall, very, very tall, just about as tall as a giraffe. And again, would have been covered with fur, and these creatures would have needed immense updrafts to help them fly, but these creatures would have also been active flyers, not just passive gliders. All right, so there's our little ones and our big ones. So rhamphorhynchoids versus pterodactyloids. Now, rhamphorhynchoids, grab my little thing here. Here we have my handy dandy Jurassic Park model of a dimorphodon. This is one of my favorite little beasties out there. Roar! There he is. This would have been considered a rhamphorhynchoid. It has a very long tail, has kind of a short, boxy face, although some of the creatures, as you can see, had a little bit more pointy snoots, but they had shorter faces in comparison to some of the rest of their bodies. And again, this long tail would have acted as a rudder when they were flying, and a short neck, not a very long neck. Like you saw that Quetzalcoatlus, which had that really long stork-looking neck. It's got a short, stubby neck. So very, very tiny neck in there. But they were relatively stable flyers. They were short and compact. They were stable flyers, maybe not terribly maneuverable, so not aerial acrobats, but they were very stable flyers. Their backbones, their vertebrae, are supported by a network of ossified tendons, kind of like a chain link fence running up and down their backbone, just to add a little bit more strength. But they started declining in the Jurassic. So what in the world was happening in the Jurassic that these poor creatures were going extinct? Well, we had another branch of these creatures that decided to go a slightly different direction. These would be your pterodactyloids. And these creatures tend to have bigger heads, fancy head displays on some of them, not on all of them. And they start reducing their tail. You can see on all three of these examples up here, there's no long rudder-like tail coming off of their bodies. They had short, stubby tails. Long wing membranes. Their wings are getting wider and wider as they're running through here. Their necks are also getting longer, and these are a little bit more maneuverable flyers. So if you're going to make a model airplane or something, these things are going to be almost the same shape as these pterosaurs, these pterodactyloids running through here. Now, these creatures were starting to decline by the end of the Cretaceous. We'll get to that a little bit later. So here we have, just to throw this up there, a whole mix of beasties, and they're not in any order whatsoever. But you can see a lot of different body plans for these rhamphorhynchoids and pterodactyloids. Now, this one over here, we have a great pterodactyloid, any of these long-tailed creatures here, long-tailed creature here. Here's my dimorphodon again there. These would be creatures that are the rhamphorhynchoids, except for one little weird one called the Neurognathus right down here at the bottom with the weird bug eyes. And that's actually a rhamphorhynchoid, but it does have a tiny tail. And they look kind of like a pterosaur nightjar. They're really freaky looking creatures. All right, so here we have our pterosaur anatomy again. Sternum, that's your breastbone, your chest bone. Your sternum is going to be where your flight muscles are attaching to on some of these creatures. And you can see on the pterosaur, it's actually a decent sized structure. It's not a teeny tiny thing like ours are. It actually has some space for those muscles to attach to. Coracoid is going to be up here. It's part of your shoulder complex, your carpals, again, your wrist bones, the fingers or the phalanges, the wing finger, running through. The pteroid is an interesting one. It's an extra little spur of bone that's coming off the carpals that is supporting a membrane in between the humerus, the upper arm bone, and the lower arms. So an extra little membrane. Got our feet way down at the bottom and all together. So are these creatures active flyers or gliders? And that anatomy is really, anatomy as well as the furry covering, is telling us that these are warm-blooded, active flyers. If you're cold-blooded, you don't want to have insulation. If you require sunlight to warm your body up, you don't want anything to get in the way of that sunlight. So you don't want a nice furry coat. You're going to put on that fur coat, and then you're going to block out all of the sunlight by all of those nice pockets of air and hair. That's not a good thing if you need the sun to warm up. So what these things have is that furry coat, which is keeping their warmth inside their body. So these creatures are already warm, and they're using that insulation to stay warm. So that's number one. So these have, again, a large attachment of flight muscles. So that's sternum. Some of them even had a keeled sternum. A keel is like the long part on a boat that sticks down in the water, kind of slices through the water. On the breastbone or the sternum, a keel refers to a big muscle attachment. And so if you eat a chicken or eat a turkey and you're cutting off the breast meat, you'll notice that the bone comes up in this big spike in the middle, and that spike in the middle is the keel. So some of these pterosaurs even had keels. And what's really cool is that they had a braced sternum, and some of the backbones were actually fused together to add strength. So it turned this really super flexible rib cage and backbone section into a hard cage, and that's going to help reduce stress for flying. If you have something really, really strong, like big strong muscle that's pulling against something super flexible, it's going to bend and flex and move. But if you have something, that same muscle pulling against a nice rigid structure, it's not going to flex as much. So that's a good way to use a pulley system for your muscles to help with active flight. Ta-da, active flight. All right, so did these creatures, if they were on the ground, if they were not flying, were they walkers, were they crawlers, did they climb? And I think there was a lot of variation in these. There was a lot of different body plans running through the pterosaurs, but in general, the legs are held to the side of the animal. Here is my daughter's handy dandy pteranodon here. You can see the legs are kind of held off to the side. They're not sticking out the bottom of the animal. So if I stick this animal up like here, yay, I shall fly around. You can see the legs would have been coming out the back end of the body. They're not sticking down below the animal. Same thing on my little Jurassic Park one. Legs are off to the side, not necessarily down below. So probably not the best at walking on two legs, but there were some trackways that may have led to some of that as well. And then they had sharp claws on their hands and feet, so good at climbing. So if they had an arboreal ancestry, not the cursorial ancestry, maybe they were using those claws to help them climb and move up trees. And the cool thing is that there have been really neat trackways found of these pterosaurs. There have been takeoff trackways, there have been landing trackways, and there have been walking trackways. And it seems that they are walking and they're moving, keeping their bodies off of the ground while their hands and their feet are in contact with the ground. Here we have our trackway. This is the wing coming off through here. Here's his foot, wing, foot, wing, foot, wing, foot. And if you look at this little drawing down below, so this great specimen is over at the Utah Geological Survey. These creatures are walking just using their hands and feet. They're keeping their bodies up off of the ground, so they're not dragging their bodies and they're not dragging their tails on the ground, which is really cool. So we have an interesting thing. We're going to switch gears a little bit. Done with pterosaurs. We're going to move on to our next group, our birds. And question here, well, this'll I'll tie in, trust me, is what came first, the chicken or the egg? And according to paleontology, the egg totally came first. So eggs are way down here. Turtles have eggs, lizards have eggs, snakes have eggs, crocodiles have eggs, and birds, which appear a little bit after these, also have eggs. So haha. So birds, what makes a bird a bird? We're getting to that egg thing. So what makes a bird a bird? Yes, they lay eggs, but there are other features that really make a bird a bird. Not all birds fly, so we can't use flight. but they are covered by a very interesting structure called a feather. Feathers are really cool. There's a lot of variation in feathers as well. We'll get to that. But birds first appeared during the Jurassic, and they lived side by side with pterosaurs and dinosaurs. So these lineages were all living next to each other at the same time. And maybe birds were causing a little bit too much competition for the pterosaurs, or maybe they were, well, they solved the problem a little bit differently. Remember, pterosaurs, their wings, their membrane are connected between their fingers, and that membrane stretches all the way down to their feet as well, or their legs. So their wing, their flight mechanism, is encompassing their hands and their feet. Now, birds edited this slightly, and they're not using their feet, although there were some oddballs we'll get to too. But they're not necessarily using their feet for flying. They can still use their feet for running, for walking, for jumping, and they're only utilizing their arms for flying. So they can do more things with their mode of flight. Kind of interesting, but definitely competition. So feathers are so cool. There are so many different kinds of feathers. It's amazing. And we have insulation and display feathers over here on the left. We've got a downy feather. We have a long phyloplume type feather, or the barbs, or I'm forgetting the name. Anyways, you have your covert feathers, which are covering your body and they're causing insulation. You have a little bit more structured, uniform feathers that are going to be useful for flight. And so you have this big gradation between feather types and functionality. They do completely different things, and a lot of different things. So I'm going to set my screen away here. Boop. All right, here we have some of those really, really cool bristles, that super simple feather off to the left end of the picture. Again, these. Here is a bristle, and these rictal bristles, rictal meaning that they're around the face, around the mouth. We've got long ones here. We've got long ones here sitting on this nightjar. People thought at first that some of these, like especially on the nightjar, were they were used to help gather insects or scoop these bugs into the mouth. And people did research on these and looked at slow motion photography and videography of these creatures. And the bristles did not help them catch food, but it seems that the bristles were helping them detect motion or pressure changes, or they had some kind of a sensory component. So these rictal bristles in through here, and the bristles under the face here of this raven. Phyloplumes, they're a little bit more decorative. So you can see the little bristly section coming out of the top of the head of this peacock, and then it has this poof of floof way at the end of this feather. It's called a phyloplume. And those are also sensory devices. So peacocks are pretty cool when they get, they fan their tails and they shake their feathers, and they're actually pushing the air as they're shaking their feathers. And the other peacocks are sensing these air movements using these phyloplumes. So they are a sensory feather. Very, very interesting. All right, so flight for birds. Again, cursorial, ground up, or arboreal, tree down. Are these gliders? Are these runners? Well, we already know that they're using their arms for flying, but they still have really, really good legs for running, although some of them hop. This is a really cool picture. It's a series of pictures, and I'll run it a couple times just so you can see. This is wing-assisted incline running, meaning that this bird is going to help you or use its wings to help run up a tree. And it's using its wings to help push itself against the tree. So it's pushing down using the wings in order for those feet to grab a hold of the tree or dirt or incline or hill easier. Some people have run into baby owls that have fallen out of a tree, and they're like, oh no, we have to get the baby owl back up in the tree. What should we do? And they approach the owl, and the owl's like, what are you doing? And the owl runs straight up the tree, using its wings to help push itself against the tree. So good choice here that these creatures would have been a more cursorial or running into flight, which is fun. Now, I'm going to mix some of these things up. I'm just going to show you some different feather types and different creatures that had feathers in that whole bird ancestry. One of the first creatures that was found that had feathers and in the world of paleontology is a creature called Archaeopteryx, or ancient wing. And this creature lived about 150 million years ago or so during the Jurassic. So again, overlapping with your pterosaurs. And the feathers of this creature were actually found before the first bones. Kind of interesting. They were able to tie the two together. And you can see we have the arm. It looks very dinosaur-like. It's got a long bony tail. It doesn't have a short tail like modern birds would have today. It's got claws on the feet. It has claws on the hands, kind of an interesting things. We do have birds today that have claws on their fingers. Juveniles, or baby of the Hoatzin, have clawed fingers when they're babies to help them climb up trees. And as they get older, the claws just kind of disappear. And if you actually look at, I think it was ostrich, some of the ratites, the ostriches and the rheas as well, if you look at their hands, they have a little claw tip on the very end of some of their fingers as well still. So we still see claws today on hands. It had teeth in its mouth. We don't have any birds today that have teeth, but there were a lot of birds previously that had teeth in their mouth. Confuciusornis, very cool creature found over in China about 120 million years ago. Now look at here. There's no long bony tail. It's shrunk. It's down into this little structure called a pygostyle. Now pygostyle is a little thing that some of these decorative feathers and some of the tail feathers can hook onto. And so if you can move the bone and the whole tail will move around. And here's this long decorative feather, almost phyloplume-like. Maybe not the greatest thing for flying, but certainly fancy. Here we have Sinornithosaurus. And again, you can see all of these little proto-feathers running through here. Not really flight feathers. We're not seeing any flight feathers on here, but there's a lot of fine insulation that's covering this whole entire animal. And again, teeth, lots of teeth, claws on the tips of the fingers, long bony tail again. Sinister Raptor is a very cool creature. Not a lot on the whole flight department, but definitely a lot on the insulation department. Beautiful, beautiful. Fine, downy structures running across the body of that animal. They've looked at the microscopic anatomy of these feather structures, or these fibrous structures, and have actually determined coloration on these creatures. So kind of a rusty color with bands of white. Very neat. Microraptor. Now I mentioned that birds aren't really using their feet for flying. Well, Microraptor makes a liar out of me. Microraptor, as you can see, the lower legs have also a secondary wing on them. So maybe they're not necessarily flapping their legs, but if their legs are out as a rigid structure, maybe like the tail of an airplane, just as an extra rudder to help them stay aloft in the air. And these creatures, again, they've looked at the microscopic feather structure and found that they were kind of grackle colored, iridescent blacks and blues and teals running through there. So that one is another creature that we actually know the colors of. And again, on beautiful, beautiful feathers. Now this one is the first bird in here, or no, excuse me, Confuciusornis would have been the first bird. So this creature, you could see, actually has these it's an asymmetrical feather, where you have the middle of the feather, if the middle of the feather is between my hands, or you have one side that's narrow and one side that's thick. And that allows feathers to overlap with each other in the wing to add a windproof structure, which allows them to flap and fly without, their feathers twisting all over the place. So it allowed those feathers to lock into place as they're flying. Very cool. Sulcavis, got a Groovebird, short tail, pygostyle, still has teeth. So again, lots of interesting bird-like creatures. I'm going to throw in Hiki just because it's so weird. It's a little dinosaur that took a very odd route for flying. It's not a pterosaur. It's not a bird. It's just a weird, sadly dead end. This creature is so weird. But it has a membrane stretched between its fingers, a short pygostyle. It's attaching to longer feathers. It's just weird. I want to learn more about this creature because it's amazing. All right, so birds and all their awesomeness. Now we're going to switch over to a different group. We have bats. And bats, here we have, again, my happy little bat. Hello. Eek, eek, eek. Bats are amazing little creatures. They have one little finger that's left with a little claw on it to help them fly, and then the rest of their fingers are modified into that long net to help support that membrane. Oop, shrink that down. So again, these are mammals with true flight. I'm not counting flying squirrels, they're gliders. I'm talking about creatures that can have sustained flight, things that are flapping their arms and they're staying airborne. They don't have to land in between, jump, take off, fly, glide for a little bit, land again. These are creatures that are actively flying. They are nocturnal, something slightly different than a lot of birds. There are nocturnal birds, but maybe this helps reduce competition. You have most of the birds that are flying around during the day, eating seeds and fruits and bugs and whatnot, hunting other animals if it's a bird of prey. And then you have these bats that are flying around doing the same thing, but at night. Okay, definitely reduces competition. They're not fighting against other flying creatures. And these are divided up into two main categories. You've got two big branches. One is the Megachiroptera, which are your fruit bats or flying foxes, really, really big animals, or tend to be big animals, very large eyes. They're so cute. Very large eyes. And then you have the Microchiroptera, which is what we have here in North Dakota. And these are generally insectivores. Some of them are piscivorous, they're fish eaters, and they're using echolocation. Your Megachiroptera, your fruit bats, are not using echolocation because they have gigantic eyeballs and they can see the fruit right there. They're going to go eat the fruit. They don't have to hunt down the fruit versus the wily little mosquitoes and the moths that are fluttering around through the air. Bats had to come up with this interesting method of tracking. So bats, before this particular fossil was found, the Onyctonicterus, before Onyctonicterus was found, most of the bat fossils that had been recovered already had the modifications and structures in the head for echolocation. So it was like, well, maybe these things are kind of evolving at the same time. You've got echolocation, you've got flight. It's really, really weird. I mean, fossil bats, it looks like a bat, even this really old one. Then we hit this one about 53 million years old, where you have insectivore teeth. It already has long, long fingers used for flight. I mean, this is a flying creature right here. But the top half of the skull, sadly, was crushed, so we weren't exactly sure how the rest of the skull was doing, if it had big eyes, if it had little eyes. But it was discovered that these creatures did not have echolocation. So then that answered one question. Did flight come first? Did echolocation come first? Did they come at the same time? And flight came first, then echolocation. So kind of interesting on that one. Very long tail on this creature. Modern bats don't have that nearly long of tail. And another interesting thing about this creature is that it has a claw on the tip of each finger. You can see a little dot here. Here's a claw. 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 And there is a claw on the tip of every single finger. Now, on bats that live today, you only have a claw on the thumb for sure, and maybe one other finger, if at all, and that's it. They don't have clawed fingers. This creature, the Onyctonicterus, had shorter, broader wings, so it was probably taking shorter flights. It wasn't maybe as maneuverable as the bats that we get today, but it had lots of good climbing and hanging adaptations. Now, the cool thing about bat wings versus the bird wings is birds are very maneuverable, yes. but the feathers have restrictions. The flight feathers have restrictions. You know, the feathers are going up, feathers are going down. You hit something like a hummingbird and they're just crazy insane for what they can do in the air. But bats are really cool because the tips of their fingers are actually slightly flexible. And as they're flapping, they can kind of wiggle themselves through the air and do amazing acrobats. So they are extremely maneuverable flyers. So Megachiroptera, my little favorite. I love Megachiroptera. They're so cool. The flying foxes have fantastic eyesight. Like I said, they have these very large eyes. They are eating fruit or nectar. They're helping pollinate different plants. You'll see pictures of them where their faces are just covered in pollen and nectar. It's pretty cool. And they can get very, very large. They can get their wings, when they're totally stretched out on the largest species, can stretch up to about 5 feet from wingtip to wingtip. That's just monstrous. Now, we don't get these up here. These are creatures that you would find like down in Australia. I wish we got them here. That would be so cool. Here we have some Megachiroptera, the fruit bats in flight. I can see how fuzzy they are. Nice big eyes running through here. Tiny ears. They don't have to do that echolocation, so they don't need the giant receptors that some of our small bats have. And this picture down here, I just wanted to show you with the mom and baby. The mom is actually flying around with the baby attached to her. So that's showing some fantastic muscle and flight control that these animals are actually carrying their young around with them. Kind of crazy. And of course, a bat blip. Gotta have a bat blip. All right, Microchiroptera. So these are the creatures that we get up here in North Dakota. These are the microbats, Microchiroptera. All right, echolocation. Again, how they're sensing some of the stuff. Echolocation is a 2-part process, one of which is they're actually vocalizing from their larynx, from their throats, and then they have to receive that information that's bouncing back to them. So you'll get very interesting nose leaf modifications, and you get ear leaf modifications. So these bats are sending and receiving this information that's coming to them. And if you've ever heard of bat, you maybe try looking up a YouTube video of it or something. They sound electronic. It's really cool. Jeff and I one summer ended up rescuing a little Microchiroptera that was in the bunkhouse over at Medora, and it was hiding asleep behind a door, but it was not a good spot for a bat to be in the middle of the day, and we were just worried that other people were going to come in and squish it. So we gathered it together in a little box and brought it over and let it go outside, and it just kind of flew away. But while it was sitting in the box, it was chittering, it was vocalizing, and it sounded like electronic music. It was really, really cool. These creatures are eating your insects and fish, so they're active hunters. Some of them even eat blood, so your vampire bats are eating blood. Again, elaborate noses and ears. And these are very, very tiny. Some are just only like 6 inches wingspan. Very, very tiny creatures. Here we have, just to show you, these, they're not so good on land. They scrabble around on the ground if they're stuck on the ground before they can climb up a little bit higher and take off for flight. They're not meant to be walking around on the ground. And a lot of these cave-dwelling species, they'll roost together. If they happen, like if one of them falls to the cave floor, you have lots of creatures that enjoy eating bat droppings and will utilize those. And if a bat also falls down to the floor and can't get airborne like right away, they will also get eaten by the bugs and things that are down on the cave floor. So they're not meant to be wandering around on the ground. We have a little bat flying out of the cave, just really cool fuzzy structures. Bats are so cool. All right, bat flight. So again, the fingers are making up the wings. Arboreal, bat fossils are extremely rare. Very, very rare. They're very fine, they're very delicate, and if they fall to the forest floor, again, insects and other things are just going to chew away at those fossils. So they are very, very rare fossils to be found. All right. Again, not great on land. They're belly crawling versus our pterosaur, who can actually lift their bodies up off the ground, or the birds who just use their feet. They just walk around on the ground, unless they're modified for other things like loons, if you ever see a loon try to walk on the ground, they're not very good at it because they're meant to fly and they're meant to swim. And they've just modified their bodies enough so that they're not so good at walking on land. Bats are not so good at walking on land either. All right, North Dakota bats. Here we have, shrink this again. So our little brown bat is very, very common here in North Dakota. We find these all over the place. Same thing with the big brown bat. Both of these are adorable. I've only seen one red bat in my life, and it is that red. It's all rusty colored. They're really, really cool. The silver-haired bat has those silver tips to the fur or the hair structures on there. Hoary bat, again, another bat, got to stick the tongue out. Just these really cool tri-colored hairs. A long-eared bat, and our Townsend's big-eared bat. All of these we can get in North Dakota, but our first two, the little brown bat and the big brown bat, are probably the most common of all the bats that I've run across in North Dakota anyways. Our Townsend's big-eared bat, these ones are also good fishers. So they're snagging fish, little tiny minnows out of the tops of water as well, not just insects. All right, now I'm going to switch my screen over to everybody else here. We're going to talk about some North Dakota bat fossils. We'll bring in the experts though.
This is a kind of a co-find by at least two of us, maybe as many as three of us, well, a minimum of three. Clint and I were searching through the collections, gosh, this must have been about 5 years ago, and discovered a fossil that looked a little bit different than anything else we'd ever seen before. Let me see here. If I think I brought something up here. So this is what we found, and bats don't look really like many other animals. There's one or two, you know, they look like voles, and they might look like wolves, and that's about it. So we did a little research of our own, and I have one of my colleagues is probably the world expert on fossil bats. And I sent him a picture of that, and he confirmed that that was indeed a fossil bat. And this entire span of teeth, these 4 teeth, is about the width of your pinky nail. So it's not very big at all. So this would have been a very small bat. Probably it's going to be one of the Microchiropteras using echolocation. And the only other bat from this time period is this guy down here at the very bottom, and they look very similar. So we moved forward, we ended up publishing on this thing, and it turns out it's not the same genus as this guy either. It's a completely brand new species, and it is named Quintentia frigidaria, which Quintentia is just in the genus most closely related to it, named for one of the researchers on fossil bats early on. And frigidaria just means of cooling, which refers to during the Oligocene time period, which this animal is from, the temperature in North Dakota and North America in general was starting to cool. And so that's kind of reflective of this bat. But the really cool thing about this animal and this fossil is its placement in the evolutionary tree. So we know a little bit about the fossils from the Eocene time period, very, very little about anything from the Oligocene. And then, of course, they pick up again during the Miocene. And this fossil bat, our fossil bat, is literally from North America, the only one from this particular time period known in the world. There is one other fossil bat that was known from this time period, but it has since been lost to science. And it was not a jaw, it was a piece of an arm bone. So in North Dakota, in our North Dakota State Fossil Collection, we literally have the only late Aurelian, early Whitneyan fossil bat in the world. That's it, and that's the specimen right there that you can see, this A to A prime.
So I guess now is the time where we run through some of our questions. Looks like we have quite a few questions built up. I don't know, do one of you want a chance to read questions to me? Or to all of us, really. I mean, all of us can answer these questions, not just me.
I'll read them off. What pterosaurs have been discovered in North Dakota?
I know the Geological Survey hasn't discovered any, but didn't Dean Pearson down in Bowman discover a pterosaur bone?
Yeah, in their review of the Hell Creek that they did in the, what was that volume? The big Hell Creek volume, was that 98 or so? Anyways, in there they have one pterosaur bone mentioned, which I think is supposed to be a neck bone, possibly from one of those big pterosaurs, kind of like Quetzalcoatlus. But my understanding, it's rather poorly preserved. There's enough to tell that it's a pterosaur, and that's about it. And that's it. One bone that we know of. Yeah. Pterosaur bones are really, really fragile. And so you have to get the exact perfect conditions to preserve them. The same with birds. Bird bones are very hard to find in the fossil record. We have a few isolated ones from different places, and then we have one partial skeleton that we've collected, and we've got it partially cleaned up, but it is very difficult to work on and needs some special love, so it's going to take a little while to get that one finished up. So any of these flying animals, because they lighten their skeletons by reducing the amount of bone that they have, any of their fossils are very difficult to preserve. And especially with birds, since most birds and all living birds don't have teeth, that would be the most likely thing to preserve. And since they don't have teeth, that kind of takes away one of the biggest things that would stick around in the fossil record.
Why can't some birds fly, and why do they have wings if they can't fly?
Some birds can't fly because they've modified their bodies to, or their bodies have been modified to reflect different food sources and environments that they are utilizing. So like a penguin is not a good flyer, not unless you launch it out of a cannon. Madagascar worked pretty well for that. So they have modified their wings to fly underwater. So they've modified their feathers even to interlock together and be a little bit more waterproof in order to facilitate a water environment instead of a flying environment. They still have wings in the case of the penguin, or the arms, because their wings are their arms. So it's just their arm is utilized for that mode of locomotion. So if they're using it for flying, or if they're using it for swimming, they're still using it, so they're not going to get rid of it. Now, creatures like ostriches or rheas, creatures that are very much not flying, they are running, they have fantastic legs for running. They've modified their feet to help grip the ground a little bit. And if you want to look at dinosaur feet, go check out a zoo that has an ostrich or a rhea or an emu and check out their feet. They're amazing. But they have these great feet that are modified for running, and they've actually reduced their wings down to little teeny, like you have this giant bird that's taller than I am, and their whole entire arm is like that long. It's really, really small. So they've started to reduce that, and they still have feathers attached to it, and they can use it for display, and ostriches will do that, and then you're like, I am fancy, look at my fancy feathers attached to my wings. But they're not using it for flying, so they're using it more for display. And because they would get in the way otherwise, it's just kind of a drag if you're running, they're reducing that, so they're shrinking it in size. So it really depends on what the bird is doing with their arms.
So along that same line, what are they doing with their fingers?
What are they doing with their fingers? Birds are kind of cool. So their hand, again, they're gluing together, or they're reducing first, and they're gluing together all of these little hand bones, the metacarpals. So they're elongating and fusing these together into a more solid structure. And a lot of your flight feathers, for those that are flying, are actually attaching to the outside edge of those metacarpals, as well as the ulna. So a good way to remember your radius versus your ulna on your lower arm here. So P is your pinky, P, U is your ulna. Your ulna is on the pinky side, and when you hit your funny bone, it stinks. So PU. So come on. I had to come up with all kinds of ways to remember stuff. So pinky ulna, and so these feathers, these flight feathers, are actually attaching to their ulnar as well. But on the hand, they're actually reducing some of those bones too, where these are all either being lost or fusing together into more solid structures. Clint, you have bird. Where is Ember? Why is Ember not here? You could be like, yeah.
Give me a second.
Oh, Clint has a great little bird here we can use for demonstration. But yeah, they're shrinking their hands, and they're just reducing the number of isolated parts and pieces down to just a few. I see a question as far as, yeah, with Hesperornis. If you look at a Hesperornis, which is our swimming bird that we do get in North Dakota, Hesperornis and any of those similar swimming birds, they've again modified their feet to look more like a grebe, where they have very long toes, which would have not webbing on them, but lobed toes to help push themselves through the water. And they have also reduced their wings. So they're not using their wings like a penguin is using them to fly through the water. They've actually reduced their wings into just little, Really?
That they can use then to help them steer and navigate while they're flying, right? Hi, Becky.
Hi. I just totally got kicked out.
I was just showing off Ember a little bit.
Such a good bird.
Come here. Yeah, he's being touchy about his wings today.
Oh.
Some days he's fine with the wings. Other days he's like, nope, those are my wings. You can find another wing somewhere else. No, I can't touch your wing. And I know to everyone it looks like he's biting me, but he's actually just grabbing my finger and moving my hand away. There's no pressure that he's using. It's just that birds, because they don't have hands, they use their mouth for everything we would use our hands for. So it looks like he's biting me, but he's actually just playing with my hand a little bit. And so if I reach for his wing, first of all, he wants to step over to that hand, but he goes, nope, I don't want you to touch my wing. So he grabs my hand and he moves it out of the way. See? Need your wing? Nope.
Okay.
So we have a question. Reptiles have scales, which they do. And does that mean that pterodactyls had scales? Becky, did pterodactyls have scales?
This one's super fuzzy.
Well, lots of animals do have scales. Reptiles have mostly scales, but even feathers where they start from are a modified scale. So evolutionarily, feathers start as scales and they get modified. And then even on birds today, if we zoom into Ember's foot, you can see his feet are all covered with scales. So even modern birds still have scales on parts of their body. So the whole idea about whether dinosaurs had scales or if they had feathers, because they're kind of in between birds and like crocodiles, they probably had both. It's just a question of where they had each of them on their body. And then if some species had more feathers and other species had more scales, that we don't know unless we find really good, well-preserved specimens. Like Dakota, the dino mummy that we have at the Heritage Center, shows us that Dakota, which is a duck-billed dinosaur, Edmontosaurus, had all scales all over its body. We have no evidence, at least in the adults, that there was any sort of feather covering. But there are other dinosaurs, like our raptors and animals like that, that are closer related to birds that actually had quite a bit of feather coverings. And part of that we can tell because, as Becky was mentioning, on the ulna, you get those knobs on the ulna where the feathers insert into the wing structure. You can see that on the bone, even if you don't have the feathers preserved. And we do, in a lot of the, quote, raptor-like dinosaurs, we do see those quill knobs preserved on the ulna. So even though we don't have the feathers themselves preserved, we know the feathers were there because of those structures. Now in pterosaurs, like Becky mentioned, they have kind of that furry-like covering across most of them, but I don't know if there's also scales anywhere on the body. I don't know pterosaurs well enough.
I haven't seen any fossils with scales on them. That's not to say they weren't there. I just haven't seen any with preservation.
How do you know which feather belonged to each dinosaur or bird?
You really don't. Yeah, you really don't. As far as that Archaeopteryx having the feather first and then finding the animal, for that one, the feather and the animal were found in the same quarry, so the same location, and they were able to look at isolated feathers from, and there's more than just that one Archaeopteryx that I showed. There are many skeletons of that animal with feathers preserved. And you can actually just look at the one feather and then look at isolated feathers on some of the Archaeopteryx and go, yes, they match. Now, 100%, maybe not, maybe it was something different, but definitely close.
What is the biggest bird and bat that ever lived?
Biggest bird, I want to say, is Apiornis as far as the rat type, so creatures that are running around on the ground. Apiornis is going to be your elephant bird, and they have, like, I can't scoot back far enough, so the eggs are gigantic. They would just dwarf an ostrich. They would make them look like a little chicken. So Apiornis is gigantic. Argentavis, I believe, was one of your largest flying birds. So that's, it would look kind of like a California condor, but like airplane sized, monstrous. So that would be one of your biggest flying birds. All right, Mr. Google, what'd you find?
That's exactly what I came up with. As you were saying it, the answers were coming up, and I'm like, yep, she's got that. Now, as far as bats, let me see, you know what the largest bat?
Oh, one of your largest bats going to have to be your Megachiroptera as far as one of the flying foxes. And I think one of the biggest ones had a 5'7" wingspan is what I read.
Giant golden crowned flying fox. It's a 3-pound bat, which is pretty heavy for a flying animal. Yeah, wingspan looks to be between 5 to almost 6 feet. That is a big bat.
That is a big bat.
I don't need to see that bat.
A bat as wide as Jeff is tall.
Are there any bats in deserts?
I would have to Google that one. I would assume yes, because you find insects in deserts. I don't know.
Yeah, I would think as long as they have a cool place to hide during the day, you know, cave or something.
Cave, hollowed out cactus, something, some kind of a little safe spot, yeah.
Jeff, what is the Brule Formation?
Brule Formation. I guess I didn't explain that, did I? So there are rock formations throughout the world. In North Dakota, we have very specific ones. They tend to be geographically and sometimes, unfortunately, named by political boundaries. You can have the same rock formation in one state or another. It can be called two different things, which is unfortunate and very confusing. The Brule Formation is refers to rocks that were laid down about 30 million years ago, let's say 32 million years ago. And they are found primarily in North Dakota, down in the southwest corner of the state, south of Dickinson. And that is one of the rock formations that we find bats in. Well, the only one in North Dakota we've found bats in so far. And it's also the same rock formation if anybody's visited the Big Badlands National Park in South Dakota, to the southeast of Rapid City. That's also the same rock formation. So it's about 30 to 32 million years old. That's the Brule Formation.
So we have, this is how they wrote it. This is not my commentary on it. It says, bit of a random question. Why are both ornithischians and saurischian considered dinosaurs? Like the theropods are more on the bird side, and the big boys like Triceratops are more related to reptiles. So why are they all under the same umbrella?
You realize I'm just going to make you, yeah, Mr. I wrote the chapter on this in a book. I'm just going to make you answer that.
So the theropods are more closely related to birds than any living animal today. But the ornithischian dinosaurs, which is the extinct side of the dinosaur tree that has Triceratops and like Stegosaurus and animals like that, are also fairly closely related to birds and would be more closely related to birds than to any other living animal today. And that's because the saurischian dinosaurs, which includes your sauropods, the big long-necked dinosaurs, and your theropods, your meat-eating dinosaurs, share a common ancestor with the ornithischians. So the Triceratops and Stegosaurus and those animals, which means that long, long ago, way back into the Triassic, there was our first dinosaur that ever showed up. And we're still trying to pin down what the first dinosaur is. More than likely, we haven't found the earliest dinosaur yet, because to find exactly that species is a difficult thing with how long the fossil record is. But at one time, there was one very earliest dinosaur. And eventually, as that dinosaur spread out and different populations separated, and then they kind of drifted apart, and this group over here started looking a little bit different from this group over here, and then they just kept looking more and more different over time. Eventually, they became different species, and then those species gave rise to other species, and then some of those became ornithischians, some of them became the Saurischians. The Saurischian side survived till today through birds, but the other side went extinct. So even though Triceratops and animals like that tend to look more like reptiles than they do like birds, they actually share a common relative with birds and theropod dinosaurs more so than they do with like crocodiles or snakes or lizards or anything like that. Yep, there we go. And that's how we do relationships. That's how we name groups, is we put animals together nowadays based on having common relatives, shared ancestors. So everything that has a single origination. So if you look at Jeff's diagram there, imagine where it says common relative, imagine that that is your parents, and then the ornithischians is, say, you, and the Saurischians is your brother or sister. So you and your sibling, your brother or sister, could eventually have your own kids, and they could have kids, and blah, 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 and those will completely diverge from each other. But at one point, you all shared a common relative, your parents. And that's how we organize groups of animals, is by animals that had the same common ancestor or the same parent way back in time. And we figure that out by looking at the fossil record and tracing back all those steps until we find where all those lines come back together, and the evidence points to one area where they all shared relatives in common with each other. And so that's the good thing about the fossil record. We can do that a bit with genetics as well by looking at DNA. But part of the issue with DNA is there's a lot of stuff in DNA, and it gets hard to tell when you're chopping up little bits of DNA and looking at them. Are you looking at the exact same piece of DNA in this species as you are over here? Sometimes it's easy, but the older those relationships get, the more changes there's been, the harder it gets to tell that you're comparing the same thing. And that's where fossils become really useful, is for looking at those older relationships amongst groups. Why did some of the fossil birds have multiple tails?
What you were looking at wasn't necessarily multiple tails, but multiple tail feathers. So like on the Confuciusornis, it had two very, very long branches coming off of its tail, and those are just individual feathers. You can get different birds of paradise that have super long feathers on their tails, or even like the pheasants that are running around my backyard. They'll have multiple very, very long feathers. So it's more of a display thing than anything else. So they're definitely not useful for flying. You reach a tipping point where your tail starts getting in the way. So like with the peacock, yes, they can fly. You don't usually see them flying, but they can fly. But those tails are definitely in the way. So you have to have a little trade-off as far as fancy tail or decent flight. And you push too far into the fancy tail, and you have a better chance of getting eaten.
All right. So this one I think was directed at you to start with, Becky, and then spread to everybody else. It says, is Hiki your favorite fossil bird, and what is everyone's, from NDGS, favorite flying reptile?
Ooh, Hiki is not necessarily my favorite, but I think it's amazing just because of how weird and how cool it is. I actually have this secondary toy here. I want to pose a question to some of the audience. So here we have a dragon whelp. We have our whelp. Based on the wing structure, would you be considering this to be a reptile, a mammal? How in the world should dragons be, how should their wings be portrayed if they're reptiles? Should they be membranous like this, or like the pterosaurs? Or should they be more mammalian, like our little bat wing here? Or should it be feathered like a bird? Kind of interesting. Anyways, something to think about, all of our dragon drawings. As far as my favorite flying creature, I love my Dimorphodon. Dimorphodon is the bestest little critter. I love this guy. I've always loved this guy. I made a life-size model of this when I was like 10. It was made out of paper mache and duct tape. And it hung from my ceiling for like 10 years. That's my favorite. Next.
I really like Quetzalcoatlus. It's just, to see something that big that flew through the air is just amazing. So, and then having done my graduate work down at the University of Texas, where we had the original specimen there and some other material, just the size of the bones is amazing. That something with bones that big, you know, arm bones that are like almost the size of a hadrosaur, a duck-billed dinosaur, and yet these things could fly is pretty amazing to think of the engineering behind that. So that's my favorite.
I have to agree. Quetzalcoatlus is by far my favorite. I think it really hammered home. I think they still have this on display. I haven't been to this museum in years, but the Science Museum in Minnesota, if I'm correct, they still have a Quetzalcoatlus on exhibit right in their front lobby. And I remember walking into that lobby and looking up and just being dumbstruck at this size. I mean, you hear about how big these things are, but to actually see it in a skeleton on exhibit it was amazing. I remember just like, wow, that thing actually flew. That is amazing. So yeah, I agree. Quetzalcoatlus is just incredible.
Yeah, they have a nice exhibit now at the Field Museum where you can stand next to one. So you can see it right here. Here's a person standing there. And then here's this fleshed out reconstruction of a Quetzalcoatlus. And just look how massive that animal is. And look at that head. That's the part that really gets me as well, is that, yeah, the body's big, but look at how long that head is, longer than this guy is tall. It's a giant skull. And so just the, like, trying to get that body off the ground had to be amazing. And I don't know much about pterosaurs as far as how they worked. I don't know if these guys were full flyers. I'm assuming they had to be, because in a lot of places, like we get them in the Hell Creek Formation, which is the end of the Cretaceous here in North Dakota, there's not a lot of like big cliffs and stuff like that for them to like jump off of and glide, unless they were, say, climbing up into big redwood trees and gliding off of those. But they pretty much had to be taking off from the ground, and just the thought of something that big taking off and flying is pretty amazing. So yeah, they're pretty neat animals.
I have actually done some reading on pterosaur takeoffs, and for the larger Quetzalcoatlus or your pteranodon or other beasties, they don't need things to launch off of, like a cliff or a tree or anything. They've looked at where the muscles are attaching and everything, and their bodies are built like giant slingshots. So based on the pterosaur trackways where they have liftoff and landing and whatnot, you can actually, and combining those along with your skeletal is really cool, because they'll essentially lean forward and they're spring loaded. And so their feet lift off, and then the wings just kind of push down and snap really fast, and it just launches them full off into flight. Very, very cool as far as just pterosaur takeoffs.
Here, I'll read off. Have you ever found a fossil ostrich?
I have not found a fossil ostrich.
Jeff, you've done field work in Australia. Did you find any ratite fossils when you guys were out there, or was it just way too old of stuff?
No, we were in the, I think we were in the Miocene when we were working. I would have loved to find something like that, but literally the biggest fossil I found was about that big. It was really important. It was the jawbone that became a new species, a new genus and a new species, but that's the biggest thing I found. We were looking in old pond sediments, so lots of fish and small mammals and things like that. Okay. No big birds, though. That would have been cool.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming and listening to me jabber on about flight and wings and birds and bats and pterosaurs and all kinds of fun things that could fly. Our next scheduled talk is for this Thursday at 10 a.m. Central. It's going to be Yara Haridi, and she's going to be talking about some paleopathologies, injuries in the fossil record, and how we know about different diseases or dinosaur diseases, which is going to be pretty cool. So again, nothing on Wednesday, nothing on Friday. We're down to 2 of these per week, so Tuesdays and Thursdays. So tune back in on Thursday for some really cool dino diseases. All right. Thank you.